nation, one voice. I am the messenger behind the vision, if you want to put it that way. The message did not originate with me, but with God. But I'm the messenger that is bringing it to all of you, my Nigerian countrymen, throughout the world and within Nigeria. And as usual, I'm going to tell you, like, subscribe, share, comment, post questions. If you feel that any part of this video or any of our podcasts, this is podcast number 4, there are some things that you think, oh no, that wasn't strictly true, or this fact was not quite correct, then please put it into the comments and I will look into it, research it, and if it's true, then I will say the truth. I pose and I stand in the place of truth, because truth is light and darkness is falsehood and lies. I will not stand there. So if you listen to this podcast or any of our podcasts and you feel like, you know what, I don't like what this guy's saying, I don't want to share, I don't want to subscribe, I don't want to like, that's fine. But I must stand on the place of truth. So now is the time really to get the elephant out of the room. We've been speaking about a civil war, or the past and the history of Nigeria. Are we a nation? Are we a country? Were we not put together by the British? And these things and those things. And you know what? I feel that history is something that we should always learn from, but we should never be stuck in that history. So for me personally, I will say to you that, you know, when we speak about the Civil War, because we're going to speak briefly about the Civil War, what may have led up to the Civil War, and where we need to go as a people. And I know there's people who say that, you know, we are different peoples. Apparently there's more than 400 languages. I thought it was about 250, but apparently there's more than 400 in Nigeria. And if that's the case, you know, even I as an individual who reads quite a bit will tell you that I know not of just the 3 main tribes. I know a few other tribes, but I can tell you there's probably tribes I am not aware of, which means I myself also need to read more. So that should be an encouragement for everyone to read more. So let's talk about Nigeria, right? Yes, is it true that the British lumped together a whole group of people and said, we are going to rule over you? 100%, no doubt, right? Apparently the Royal Niger Company owned the land that we now call Nigeria, owned the people. And you can see what I'm doing is quote unquote, because the truth of the matter, it's funny how a company or a group of people can say that we own this land. Not that we founded this land, but because we have maybe more power than its indigenous people, more than its inhabitants, we're going to claim this land. And I don't want to get too much into the history of the world and different countries and where this has happened, or may even happen in the future, because there is nothing new under the sun. I want to stick to where they were. So in 1899, the Royal Niger Company sold to the British government the land that we now call Nigeria, and a little bit more because it involved parts of what is now Cameroon. But they sold it for £865,000. And as of 2014, the equivalent would have been about approximately 41 million. We could give or take and say that's about 60 million pounds. I know, not a lot for a large group of people and a land. But nevertheless, as I said, these sort of things should not happen, but they did happen. Now, what did the British government do? They went on to colonize as much of that land as they could, and they did, right? What you call Northern Nigeria became the Northern Protectorate. What you call Lagos and Lagos area became the Lagos colony, or the colony. And what you call outside of Southwest, Southeast, South, Mid-West became what was the Southern Protectorate. And in 1914, Lord Lugard said, we're going to amalgamate these protectorates and the colony, and we're going to call it Nigeria. Now, I was saying that we were going to talk briefly about the Civil War, and we're going to talk about what led up to that Civil War. And you know, many people think that the coup of January 15th, 1966, that was led mainly by 7 majors, 6 of which were Igbo, 1 was Yoruba. I'm only stating these things because there's certain facts that people spout, and many of the rank and file were not traditionally Igbo, but it was termed an Igbo coup. And I'm going to speak about why that happened and why people believed it was an Igbo coup and why the British were happy to call it an Igbo coup. So we go back now and we say, okay, I'm not going to cover everything in history, by the way, but 1960, we have independence. Some say it was mainly pushed from the south, from Awolowo and Azikiwe, and that the north were prepared. Or I say the North. I really hate using this general term, the North. I said this before, multiple tribes in the North, so it's really hard to say. But let's say what was the Northern Protectorate, what later became the Northern Region, was said to be more against an independence, but still being dependent on the UK, right? It was only up until 1963, from 1960 to 1963, we still had our head of state being the Queen. In 1963, she was no longer the head of state and Nigeria became a republic, right? So let's go back to what we were saying. So 1960, there was independence. The governor or councillor general at that time was Azikiwe, who took over from Macaulay. And then in 1960, right, NCNC, which was the party which he was heading up, allied itself with the MPC, which was the party of then Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa, and also Sir Ahmadu Bello, who was the Sardana of Sokoto. Right. So we have now Azikiwe as the president, Tafawa Balewa as the Prime Minister, and the Sardana of Sokoto was the Premier of the Northern Region. In the Eastern Region, it was Dr. Michael Opara, and in the Western Region, it was Chief Obafemi Awolowo. So, excuse me. Let me say that again. Sorry, my apologies, my mistake. Chief Akintola was the Premier of the Western Region. Chief Obafemi Awolowo was the head of the Action Group Party, right? Of which Akintola was the deputy head of that party. You see, there's so much to Nigerian history. Okay, so we are now on this new era of Nigerian independence, and there's a euphoria. What is Nigeria going to be? Where is it going to go? Now, even in that time, there were ethnic rivalries and tribal conflicts. Before even independence, in 1945, and I believe in 1953 or 1956, there were riots in the north. The ones in 1953 or 1956, please correct me, in Kano were mainly due to politics, right? So it was protesters from different parties, the Action Group, against protesters of the MPC. So what I'm trying to say is, nevertheless, but there were riots, and some of it, there was still this simmering of tribalism and ethnic rivalry and conflict. So in 1962, there was a crisis, right? And that crisis came about in the Western Region House of Assembly between Chief Obafemi Awolowo and Chief Akintola. And it was a conflict between where should the action group ally themselves? Should it be with the eastern state, right? Mainly, not really the eastern state, but mainly Azikiwe, the NCNC, or should it be with the northern region, Tafawa Balewa, right? The MPC. So there was a spat, and Chief Akintola was asked they deposed him from deputy head of the action group, and he was asked to resign from the Premier of Western Region position. He wanted to ally with Tafawa Balewa and the MPC and the Northern Region, and again, as I said, Awolowo wanted to side, if I haven't said it already, with Azikiwe. So there was a crisis in the assembly. The Prime Minister, Tafawa Balewa, said that constitution was not being upheld in the Western Region. So the first state of emergency that Nigeria had known of its history post-independence was initiated. You can argue whether that should have been initiated or not, considering that the crisis was in the House of Assembly and not really in the land, but nevertheless, it was initiated, right? And in 1963, Awolowo was charged with, Chief Obafemi Awolowo was charged with treason and was sent to prison for 10 years. But as you already know, came out later during Gowon's government. I don't know whether they considered him to now be innocent, but who knows. And he became a minister, I believe Minister of Finance. Nevertheless, he was imprisoned. So that led most of his supporters and faction, right, to be driven underground. So weren't as vocal. Chief Akintola led his own group, which became another party, I believe it's the NNDP, to ally now with the MPC, which the amalgamation looked like the NNA. And the amalgamation of those who were still vocal of the action group with the NCNC became the UGPA, right? So they allied for election. Then in 1964, there was elections taking place in Nigeria. And apparently there was a lot of election rigging. So this was now, again, post-independence, the first time that there was real election rigging in Nigeria. And this led to much unrest. Yeah. Tafawa Balewa's party, with Akintola, they won the election, right? But now there was much unrest. There were mass murders. There was arson. There was looting. They actually coined the Western region as being the wild, wild West. Many people were losing their lives, both in the Western region and what is now seen as the Midwest. So, at that point in time, Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa did not want to initiate a state of emergency, and it wasn't initiated. But there was huge instability in the land, even into 1965 and the end of 1965. There was a point in time that the president at that time, Nnamdi Azikiwe, did ask for the higher ranking military officers to step in and to bring about fair elections. That request was denied, and Azikiwe, for a short period of time, was placed under house arrest. Now, we find ourselves around from what is stated by the coup plotters of January 15, 1966, that it was possible that they were planning their coup from August of 1965. Some are saying that they were trying to preempt a coup that was coming in January 17th, 1966. But all these things cannot necessarily be verified. I can only base it on what information we have on ground, right? So if you have any verifiable information outside of the information I've given, please post it in the comments. I will definitely go and read and do my research. So don't have any worries about that. But in January 15th, 1966, there was a coup. And people say this coup changed history in Nigeria. It was Nigeria's first military coup, although there are people in different sides of the argument that would say the first coup was really against Chief Obafemi Awolowo to depose him from that place of influence in the Western region's politics. Nevertheless, the first military coup that we know of in post-independence Nigeria was January 15th, 1966. Now, the coup plotters themselves, and the reason why many are saying it was an Igbo coup is because there were seven majors approximately, I believe, and one of the majors, six of them were Igbo, and one of them was Yoruba. And they're saying it was an Igbo coup because some notable leaders, not just of what was the northern region, you have to remember for most Nigerians, but Nigerian leaders were killed. And I always say honestly that if you hear about how some of them died, it's not really killing, it's more like, even killing is bad enough, but it looked like murder, right? Murder as well. They were assassinated. And amongst those were the Prime Minister, Tafawa Balewa, was killed. The Sardana Sokoto, the Northern Region Premier, Sir Amadu Bello, was killed. Chief Akintola, the Premier of the Western Region, was also killed. And then there's a number of names of which I'm going to only mention a few. So you're going to notice me looking down. I'm not hiding from you. I'm actually reading. Brigadier, and if I don't pronounce these names correctly, please, I apologize. But Brigadier Zakaria Mamalari, Colonel Arthur Chinyelu Unebe, who was a friend of Brigadier Mamalari, who incidentally, as I'm sure by the name you know, he was of Igbo origin. Colonel James Pan, Brigadier Samuel Ademelegun, and his wife, trying to really pronounce that one there. Colonel Ralph Sodiende, Chief Festus Okoti Ebo, the Minister of Finance from the Midwest, Colonel Kur Mohammed, Colonel Abago Lajema, and a few other police officers. So, there was this coup. And the Eastern region, Dr. Michael Opara, the Premier, was not killed. So, initially there was a euphoria because people understood there was instability in the country, and there was people were somehow celebrating it. But then news started to leak that, hold on, all these top politicians in the north and the west were killed. What happened to the politicians that were top politicians that were in the east? Dr. Michael Opara, why wasn't he rounded up and killed? Why wasn't Agaye Ironsi, GOC, killed, or arrested or killed? First of all, I'm going to say that I'm going to mention the coup plotters. And I'm going to say that I don't agree with coup plotting, and I don't agree with treason. That's the first point. And I also do not agree with the killing of people, no matter what part of Nigeria they're from, or even what part of the world they're from, right? Everybody has a right to life. And I know some of you might say, oh, that sounds very idealistic, but we live in this contemporary world where blah, 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 and would like to justify. I personally can't justify killing, right? So, nevertheless, Azikiwe was in London. Don't know why Nigerian politicians like to go to London, but healthcare might be quite good. But nevertheless, the point is he was in London, receiving treatment, so he wasn't in Nigeria at the time. Now, so it started to look tainted. Why is it that the Eastern politicians from the Eastern region were spared, yet those who were dear to the hearts of the other regions were killed? I mean, in the Western region, there was still that kind of rivalry between Owolowo and Akintola, but I don't believe that anybody would have liked to hear that the premier of the Western region was actually killed. So again, I reiterate, out of the 7 majors, 6 of them were Igbo. Amongst those, we could look at Major Anthony Anaforo. It's not on my list, but I know he was there. Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzogu, who I believe was the chief plotter and was born in Kaduna, spoke Hausa. Not much Igbo actually, spoke a lot of Hausa. But he was Igbo. Major Adewale Adomayaga, again Adomayaga. My wife will probably hear this and say it's pronounced a particular way. My apologies. He was Yoruba. Captain G. Adeleke was Yoruba, as we know. Major Ifajana, if I've not mentioned, was Igbo. I'm talking about the coup plotters here. Lieutenant Fola Oyewole was Yoruba. Lieutenant R. Ebiko from Isan. Lieutenant Tijani Katsina, Hausa Fulani. Lieutenant O. Olafemiyan, Yoruba. Captain Gibson Jalo, or Jalo, please, my pronunciation, from Bali. Captain Swanton, Middle Belt. Lieutenant Hope Harris Egega, Urobo. Lieutenant Dag Waribo Ijo, he's a South, if you don't know. Second Lieutenant Saleh Dambo Hawassa. Second Lieutenant John Aton Pera from Tiv. So, and then also the soldiers that mainly hailed from the northern region. And that's only because many of the officers, or let's say middle ranking officers, were Igbo or Yoruba, I believe, at that time, and most of the soldiers were of northern origin. Right. Now, I don't want to get into the bits of I don't want to get into the whole side of why didn't the soldiers act against the majors and the coup plotters and the captains that were actually leading them, right? Because that's a hard place to go to. First of all, from what we know of data information, Nzogu was in military intelligence and also was sending them on training missions. I'm not trying to go on one side or another. Remember what I said, I just believe in truth, right? I know a little bit about the military, and if you listen to any of my other videos, you'll know what I thought about the peaceful protesters who were mainly students that were killed in Lagos, right? I knew it was a military operation. I stated it was a military operation, and as far as I'm concerned, it was a military operation. Or if we look at Zazaki in the north and what happened to those protesters, just go and see the video, you'll know the military was involved. What I'm saying is this: was it an Igbo coup? Well, if we say something is an Igbo coup, that means that it is at the collusion of the majority of Igbo officers that were in the Nigerian army at that point in time. But it wasn't. If we say it was an Igbo coup, then we are saying that the general populace of the Igbo people knew the machinations of those Igbo officers at that time, those Igbo majors, but they didn't. So where do we now say it was an Igbo coup? If that is an Igbo coup, then not because I mentioned other officers, don't get it twisted, from other tribes. No. But if that's an Igbo coup, then the 5 other military coups that we've had 7 actually, 2 were coup attempts, right? The 5 other military coups that we've had in Nigeria, right, that were led by northern, or what we call not northern, what people call northern, as in northern origin officers, are northern coups. But I'm going to say to you honestly, I know a lot of people will say they were, and I'm going to tell you, they're not. They're not, because they're not, the people in the north of Nigeria, the northern Nigerians, are not in collusion with these officers. I'm sure they didn't even know about Ibrahim Babangida, right, going to, make a coup attempt, or Sani Abacha. What did any of these leaders do for their people? For the people in Nigeria, let alone the people in northern Nigeria, what did they do for them? This is why I always keep on saying there must be a split between what we see as the masses and what we see as the elitists. Unfortunately, what the problem that we have in Nigeria is that when we hear a news, or when people hear a news, they like to group a whole people. I'm going to sneeze. So, when people heard about the Delta militants, it was all the Delta people, right? When they heard about a few radical Fulanese, it was all the Fulanese. When they hear about Nnamdi Kanu and the Biafra movement, it's all the Igbos. When they hear about Oduduwa, Yoruba speaking about Oduduwa, of which Chief Obafemi Awolowo was probably the originator of that whole term and movement of Oduduwa, they think all Yoruba people. Look, we need to get away from these generalisms. That's why we need to state facts. What are the facts on the ground? The facts on the ground is that number of people were killed, assassinated, murdered, because some military officers, at least from the majors, mainly Igbo and the Yoruba, and then other officers, decided that they could no longer handle or take the unrest, and then carried out a coup, which was, to me, honestly, the way they carried it, it was naive. It was naive. In a country like Nigeria that has multiple ethnic groups and has that kind of rivalry and that simmering underneath, right, of a potential crisis amongst the ethnic groups, it was naive, and it was poorly planned. I'm not into coup plotting. Remember what I said, I'm not into coup plotting. But if you're going to do something, you have to do it properly. If you're going to kill, right, remember I said I'm not into killing, but I'm thinking about from a military mind. If you're going to kill X amount of leaders saying that they are corrupt, then you have to make sure that you prosecute that coup properly in every part of the country, because there can always be sentiments that will arise. Thanks for watching the first part. We had to cut it because it's a 54-minute video, and I didn't think that most people are going to try to watch it all the way through, and just make it more easier and entertaining for you. So we split it into part 1 and part 2. So this is part 1. Watch out next week for part 2. I hope you found it informative and you learned a lot. And then also, please, I keep on saying, please share, subscribe, and most importantly, share. If you think that you're hearing good stuff and good information, it's knowledgeable, it's changing parts of the way that you think, then please send it out. Imagine if you just send it out to 10 people, that would be good. Thank you. See you. God bless.